Somewhere in the British Motor Museum at Gaydon, in Warwickshire, there sits a small yellow sports car that was never sold to anyone. It is Inca yellow, a warm, slightly metallic shade that suited the car rather well, and it carries the factory hardtop and the overdrive option. It was the last Triumph Spitfire ever assembled. It rolled off the Canley production line in August 1980, was set aside, and has been in museum care ever since. The dealer who was supposed to receive it never got the call. The customer who might have driven it home never existed. Nobody marked the occasion. There was no ceremony at the factory gates, no press release, no photograph of management in suits shaking hands beside the finished car. The Canley plant in Coventry, which had been building Triumphs since Standard Triumph moved there after the war was closing, and the people who worked there had considerably more pressing things to think about than the sentimental significance of one small yellow two-seater. Jobs were going. The factory was shutting. British Leyland was in a state of managed crisis that would eventually consume the Triumph name entirely, retiring the mark in 1984. And so the last Triumph Spitfire just sat there, finished, Inca yellow, waiting for a buyer who was never going to come. That is the story at the end of this car's 18-year production run, but the story at the beginning in 1962, when Britain was in the full swing of the Macmillan years, and the idea of an affordable two-seat sports car for ordinary buyers felt genuinely exciting, that story is considerably more cheerful. And the journey between those two moments, from the launch of the Spitfire Mark I at the London Motor Show to that yellow car sitting quietly in a museum, takes in some of the most interesting chapters in the history of the affordable British sports car. That is what we are going to cover today. Section 1. 1862 and the car that almost wasn't built. The Triumph Spitfire very nearly did not exist, and the way it came into being says a great deal about the particular creative pragmatism of the British motor industry in the early 1960s. The story begins in 1957, when Standard Triumph commissioned Italian designer Giovanni Michelotti, who had already designed the Triumph Herald Saloon, to produce a small sports car body. Michelotti worked up a prototype on a shortened version of the Herald's separate backbone chassis, using the Herald's running gear. The result was an elegant, purposeful two-seater with a single-piece front end that hinged forward to give unparalleled access to the engine, a feature that every subsequent Spitfire owner would come to appreciate. Standard Triumph codenamed the prototype the Bomb. They then ran out of money. The project sat in a corner of the factory under a dust sheet for years, while Standard Triumph's finances deteriorated. It was not until 1960, when Leyland Motors took over the company, that the resources became available to put the car into production. Leyland officials, taking stock of their new acquisition, found Michelotti's prototype exactly where it had been left under that dust sheet, and rapidly approved it for production. The production car changed very little from what Michelotti had designed, and it was introduced at the London Motor Show in 1962. Britain in 1962 was in the middle of what Macmillan had memorably described a few years earlier as never having had it so good. Car ownership was expanding. Young professionals and young families had money that their parents never had, and some of them wanted to spend it on something that made getting to work or getting to the coast at the weekend feel like a small adventure. The Austin Healey Sprite had already demonstrated there was a market for a genuinely affordable two-seat sports car. The Spitfire arrived to compete directly with the Sprite and the MG Midget, and it immediately impressed most observers as being the better-looking car. In UK specification, the Mark I's 1,147 cubic centimeter four-cylinder engine produced 63 brake horsepower at 5,750 revolutions per minute, and 67 pound-feet of torque at 3,500 revolutions per minute. That gave a top speed of 92 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 16.4 seconds. Wind-up windows, which the Sprite and Midget still lacked, were standard. Front disc brakes were standard. Independent rear suspension was standard. Motorsports Bill Body, a notoriously difficult man to impress who maintained an ongoing public feud with Triumph's management, was nonetheless sufficiently taken with the car to compare it favorably to the Voiturette racing cars of the 1920s. That was high praise from a man who gave it to almost nobody. The Spitfire's export ambitions were considerable from the outset. By the time George Turnbull, Standard Triumph's general manager, drove the 100,000th Triumph Spitfire off the Canley production line on the 8th of February 1968, more than 75% of all Spitfires built had been exported outside the United Kingdom. 45% had gone to the United States alone, 25% to mainland European markets. For a small company from Coventry, those were extraordinary export numbers. Section 2. The best Spitfire, the Mark III and the engineering that mattered. The Triumph Spitfire went through 5 iterations across its 18-year life. The Mark I, the Mark II from 1965, the Mark III from 1967, the Mark IV from 1970, and finally the Spitfire 1500 from 1975 for the home market. Each generation addressed specific criticisms and added specific improvements, and by the time the Mark III arrived, the car had reached something close to its natural peak. The Mark III brought the engine that the Spitfire had always deserved. The original 1,147 cubic centimeter unit was replaced by a bored-out 1,296 cubic centimeter version, the same bore of 73.7 millimeters, with the stroke retained at 76 millimeters, producing a claimed 75 brake horsepower at 6,000 revolutions per minute and 75 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 revolutions per minute. The Mark III was the fastest Spitfire yet, reaching 60 miles per hour in 13.4 seconds and achieving a top speed of 95 miles per hour. Average fuel consumption was 33 miles per imperial gallon. But the Mark III's greatest contribution was perhaps its folding hood. The original Spitfire's hood had required stopping the car and physical effort to erect from the boot. The Mark III's hood folded neatly behind the seats and could be raised without getting out of the vehicle. This sounds like a minor improvement until the first cloud arrives over the M4 at speed, at which point it becomes the most important feature on the car. The Mark IV of 1970 brought the most controversial and arguably the most important engineering change in the Spitfire's history. The original rear suspension used a swing axle arrangement that allowed significant camber changes. Under hard cornering, the rear tires could adopt an angle that seriously compromised grip and, in extremis, led to sudden oversteer. Many early Spitfire owners will know exactly what we are talking about. Triumph's solution was elegant in its simplicity. They removed one leaf from the rear spring stack, mounted only the bottom leaf rigidly to the differential, and allowed the remaining leaves to pivot freely. This swing-spring arrangement, as Triumph called it, moderated the worst camber changes without major redesign cost. Motorsport magazine's verdict was plain. The handling is now beyond reproach, and sudden changes of direction can be achieved much more predictably than before. Whether every Spitfire owner agreed with beyond reproach is debatable, but the improvement was real and measurable. The Mark IV also brought the camtail rear styling that gave the car a strong family resemblance to the larger Triumph Stag and Triumph 2000 models, all of them Michelotti designs, all of them sharing that clean, cut-off treatment at the tail. It was a more modern look than the rounded rear of the earlier cars, though opinions on whether it was more attractive remain divided. Section 3. The 1500. The car that America forced and Britain accepted. The Spitfire 1500 arrived in the United States and Canada in 1973, and in the rest of the world from 1975. Its existence was, at least in part, a direct consequence of American emissions legislation. By the early 1970s, the American market, which had been buying 45% of all Spitfires produced, was imposing increasingly stringent requirements on imported vehicles. The compression ratio had to be reduced, catalytic converters were required, an exhaust gas recirculating system was mandated. On the existing 1,296 cubic centimeter engine, all of these requirements combined to produce a car that simply did not go quickly enough to be credibly sold as a sports car at any price. A larger engine was the only practical answer. The solution was a 1,493 cubic centimeter unit drawn from the Triumph 1500 saloon and marina range, bored to 73.7 millimeters and stroked to 87.5 millimeters in UK specification with an 8.0 compression ratio. This engine produced approximately 71 brake horsepower and made the Spitfire 1500 noticeably more tractable in everyday use. The increased torque made it far more forgiving in traffic and at TVA motorway speeds than the earlier high-revving units. Road and Tracks testing of the UK specification 1500 recorded 0 to 60 miles per hour in 13.2 seconds, confirming that the larger engine made the car quicker in real-world conditions despite the modest power figure. There was, however, a problem with the 1,493 cubic centimeter engine that became increasingly apparent over time, and that honest buyers of these cars today need to understand. The crankshaft ran on only 3 main bearings. This had been acceptable in lower-stressed earlier applications, but in the Spitfire, where the engine was consistently used toward the top of its rev range, it resulted in an engine that was, as the Wikipedia assessment diplomatically puts it, rather rough and more prone to failure than the earlier units. Crankshaft wear was the specific concern. The crank could wear badly, along with pistons and rings, especially if oil changes were neglected or if the engine was run hard before it reached proper operating temperature. Owners who knew this and serviced accordingly often got many tens of thousands of miles without serious trouble. Owners who did not sometimes got considerably less. In America, the 1500 was further compromised. A single Zenith Stromberg carburetor replaced the twin SU items of the UK car. The compression ratio was reduced to 7.5 to 1 to run on lower-octane unleaded fuel. Add a catalytic converter and the exhaust gas recirculating system, and the American market 1500 produced just 53 brake horsepower. 0 to 60 miles per hour took 16.3 seconds. The Haggerty Buyer's Guide noted with admirable restraint that by the late 1970s, the Spitfire and its rival, the MG Midget, had become harder sells in America, frequently turning up as prizes on television game shows like Let's Make a Deal and The Price is Right. That is a fate that speaks for itself. The final 2 years brought one more visual change that has divided opinion ever since. From 1979 and on the 1980 cars, the chrome bumpers fitted on American market cars were replaced with single-piece black rubber bumpers front and rear, with chassis extensions fitted beneath the boot to support them under the 5 miles per hour impact standards the American regulations required. On a car whose proportions had been laid out in 1957, these large rubber additions did the car no aesthetic favors. The UK market retained chrome bumpers throughout. Section 4. The 1980 model. The heaviest, the most equipped, the last. The 1980 Spitfire 1500 was, by measurable fact, the heaviest Triumph Spitfire ever built. It weighed 1,875 pounds, 850.5 kilograms. When the Mark I had left the factory in 1962, it weighed approximately 1,476 pounds. 18 years of additional equipment, safety requirements, and regulatory compliance had added nearly 400 pounds to a car whose fundamental structure had not materially changed. And yet, within that weight, there was more equipment than any previous Spitfire had carried. The final years of production had brought reclining front seats with headrests, column stalk controls for minor functions replacing the old dashboard-mounted knobs and switches, a walnut veneer dashboard, hazard warning flashes, and an electric screen washer replacing the previous manual pump. The overdrive, an option on third and fourth gears, was widely specified and made the car considerably more relaxed on motorway journeys. The factory hardtop, which converted the Spitfire into something approaching a snug Grand Tourer for winter use, remained one of the most popular options throughout the car's life. The base price in the United Kingdom in 1980 was £3,631. In the United States, the same car cost $7,365. For comparison, a new Ford Fiesta could be bought in Britain at the time for considerably less, and a Volkswagen Golf, which offered considerably more car in almost every practical sense, was being snapped up by the buyers who once might have considered a Spitfire. The car's US market had been shrinking for years. 95,829 Spitfire 1,500s were produced across the model's run, from 1974 to 1980, a respectable total, but significantly below the rates achieved by the earlier cars in their prime years. The factory closure at Canley had been coming for some time, a consequence of British Leyland's rationalization program under a management team that was simultaneously fighting for the company's survival, dealing with acute industrial relations problems, and trying to redirect investment toward more modern models. On the 26th of August 1980, the last Triumph Dolomite and the last Triumph Spitfire were produced at Canley. The factory would serve other purposes briefly, but car production had ended. The TR7 moved to Rover's Solihull plant. The Spitfire did not move anywhere. It was simply finished. Section 5, What was left behind and why it matters. The car itself, that Inca yellow hardtop with overdrive, never sold, sitting in the British Motor Museum at Gaydon, represents the end of something considerably larger than a single model's production run. It was the end of the affordable British open sports car as a going commercial concern. 2 months after Canley closed, MG's Abingdon factory also shut, ending production of the MGB and the Midget simultaneously. The following year, the TR7 and TR8 were cancelled when the Solihull road car operation closed. The Triumph marque itself was retired in 1984. BMW now holds the rights to the Triumph name acquired when it bought the Rover Group in 1994, and the Canley site was demolished in 1996. Road names in the area now carry the only memorial most of the factory will ever have: Spitfire Close, Herald Avenue, Toledo Close, Dolomite Avenue. 314,000 Spitfires were built across 18 years. The majority of them served their owners faithfully and well, providing exactly the open-air motoring experience they were sold on at prices that made it accessible to buyers who could not afford an E-Type or a Lotus. The car won numerous SCCA National Sports Car Championships in F&G production classes in America. It won its class at the 1964 Tour de France Rally, coming second overall behind the outright winner. It was, in the hands of club racers across Britain and America, a genuine competitor. And it left a legacy that nobody who bought one in 1980, or who was working at Canley on the 26th of August of that year, could possibly have anticipated. In 1982, a Mazda engineer handed his boss the keys to his own Triumph Spitfire. 2 years later, the Mazda MX-5 project formally began. The connection between the Spitfire's concept lightweight, front engine, rear-wheel drive, open two-seater, affordable, and the formula that Mazda successfully revived for a global market in 1989 is not coincidental. The MX-5 became the best-selling open two-seater in the history of the automobile. The car that inspired it is sitting in a museum in Warwickshire, painted Inca yellow, waiting for precisely nobody. The last Triumph Spitfire 1500 was not a great car by any objective standard. It was heavier than it should have been, less powerful than it had been, burdened with regulations. It was too old to meet elegantly, and priced against Japanese and German competition that offered more of almost everything practical. The British motor industry's industrial and financial problems had worn the car down over the years until what remained was an honest but tired machine with its best years well behind it. And yet nobody who has spent time behind the wheel of a Spitfire, any Spitfire, at any stage of its development walks away without understanding why these cars inspired the loyalty they did. They are small and direct and alive in a way that very few cars from any era manage. With the top down and a dry road ahead, they remind you of something important about why driving can be a pleasure rather than a transaction. The 1500's engine problems are real but manageable. Its weight is real but modest by modern standards. Its performance, by the measures of 1980, was nothing special. But by the measure of what a car is supposed to do, which is to make you glad you got into it, the last Spitfire still delivers. Somebody decided that the very last one should never be sold. Given everything that was ending when it was built, the factory, the mark, an entire era of affordable British open car motoring, that decision feels right. It deserved to be kept. Now, we want to hear from you. Did you own a Spitfire? Have you driven one recently? Or found one under a tarpaulin in a garage somewhere? Perhaps you remember seeing one on a British or American road in the 1970s when they were still everywhere. Or perhaps you are one of the Americans who received one as a game show prize. Every story about these cars is worth telling. If this video has been worth your time, please give it a like. It helps us reach more people who share this passion for cars that mattered. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do that now. We have many more stories to tell. Thank you, genuinely, for watching.